Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I would like to start this session with a little story. So, I'm one of the very lucky persons to have been fully vaccinated. And while I got my first shot in Ibadan, a major city in Nigeria, my second dose was at the Turef Hall, which is a historic place in Telford, a city that is located in the United Kingdom's West Midland region. And the differences in both experiences are quite astonishing. In Ibadan, for instance, I had to wait for weeks because of the large number of persons that visited the vaccination site as early as 5 a.m. and sometimes 4 a.m. But in the UK, when I walked into the vaccination center, there were no queues. It's therefore not surprising that the part of the UK where I got my second vaccine shot from had full vaccination coverage nearing 90% for some age groups. While in my hometown in Ibadan, we had fully vaccinated just around 4% of the people back then. I shared this experience in an article that I wrote for Business Insider. And in another piece that I wrote for DevEx, I also shared the challenges facing vaccine rollouts in Africa, and equity issues rank very high. But with more doses of vaccines becoming increasingly available, the news reports then shifted to countries in the region being unable to quickly roll out the vaccines, which was later attributed to the short expiry date of the vaccines that were donated. Which is why on today's webinar, we'll be taking a closer look at vaccine inequity and its implications for global health. So join me in welcoming Dr. Maduka Pai, who is a professor. Professor Pai is also the Associate Director of the McGill International Tuberculosis Centre. He's also the editor-in-chief of the PLOS Global Public Health Journal. So I'll say thank you for joining us today, Dr. Pai. And we are really great for you to be joining us. And we are also joined by Priti Krishtel. Priti is a lawyer who co-founded the United States-based non-profit organization, the Initiative for Medicines Access and Knowledge, abbreviated as I-MAK. She's a critic of pharmaceutical intellectual property law and an advocate for patent reform. Hello, Priti, and thanks for joining us today. Is she there? Your mic is off.
Hi, Prof. It's good to be
Yeah.
here.
Yeah, I'm really happy for us to be joining us today. And we're also joined by my good friend, Dr. Mfeanyi Nsofor. Dr. Nsofor is the Senior Vice President for Africa at the Human Health Education and Research Foundation. Dr. Ifeanyi, good afternoon, and how is the weather and how is everything over there? Dr. Mfeanyi? We'll get back to him. We are having audio issues with him. And our fourth panelist today, or tonight, for participants joining us from India and nearby countries, is Dr. Bassey Ebenso, who is a lecturer and researcher at the University of Leeds School of Medicine, where he teaches international public health. Dr. Bassey, how are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. And
Yes.
a privilege to be on this discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. I would also like to use this opportunity to welcome our participants that are joining us from different parts of the world. And if you would like us to know where you are joining from, you can indicate by telling us in the chat option on the Zoom platform. And if you are watching this session via the Facebook live stream, you can use the comment box below this video that you are watching for your for your comments. While if you want to ask questions, I encourage you to use the Q&A option on this Zoom platform for your questions. So I would like to start this conversation with Prof. And a lot has been said, Prof, about inequity, and but personally, following the conversations and having more information about this than many other individuals, what have you found to be the most intriguing, underreported, or totally ignored aspect of the state of COVID-19 vaccine inequity?
You're asking me, Paul?
Yes, Prof. Yeah, that's for you, sir.
It's kind of very strange. Like you, I also go through this conflict, right? 85% of Canadians have received one dose of the vaccine, and when I look at low-income countries, that number is 10%. And those of us who kind of straddle both worlds have seen how devastating this virus can be. For me, the vaccine inequity crisis was truly brought home when I saw the devastating impact of the Delta variant in India. In just a matter of few months, millions of people died, and that just woke me up to how devastating this can be if we do not vaccinate the whole world. And so, to me, I think this is personal, and I think for a lot of people in the global north, I don't think they quite understand how privileged we are to be double vaxxed and triple vaxxed. And what bothers me most these days is the growing cacophony that somehow the pandemic is over. Triple vax privileged people sitting in the global north declaring the end to the pandemic when 3.2 billion people are completely unvaccinated. I find that reckless, I find that irresponsible, and I find that narrative very dangerous. But this virus is far from done with us. We may be done with it, but it's not done with us. So we have to continue doubling our efforts and make sure everybody has the level of protection they need to just survive this pandemic and whatever new variants are going to emerge next.
Yeah, Dr. Bassey, I would like to bring you in regarding this issue, especially from the perspective of the science ecosystem. You've written extensively on a number of topical global health issues, but one thing that became obvious for me, I think, that we are also seeing in the angle of vaccine inequity, and especially in the context of this COVID-19 pandemic, is what seems to be a wide gap that exists between the science ecosystem and the research ecosystem and the public health policy makers and those that are actually implementing those policy directions. What am I trying to say? It is well documented reports and statements have been issued regarding why everybody should be able to have access to the vaccine so that the world can actually make progress in the global response to this. But we don't see that happening actively. So why do you think we still have this, what seems to be a gap between the science ecosystem, public health experts like yours, publishing and providing scientific guidance, and those that are expected to actually initiate these policies and ensure what the science ecosystem is recommending? So why do we have that gap?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think one thing that has been neglected is the interconnectedness of politics, science, and economic here. You see, in global health, we are trained to really look at inequities and inequalities in general. And what COVID-19 has really highlighted is that interconnectedness of politics, science, and the markets, or economics. You would remember when COVID first started, and most countries, including Western countries and low and medium income countries, all experienced COVID at the same time, almost at the same time. It baffled everyone. It baffled the Western countries because we had always thought that the health systems of the Western countries were robust, were strong, were resilient, and would be able to withstand any push. And it then became immediately obvious when it came to responding to COVID in each country, whether those were in high-income countries or low-income countries, that the interconnectedness of politics, science, and economics immediately kicked in. And what do I mean by that? You would remember that in some countries, the politicians and policymakers, even when science was beginning to provide some insight into what needed to be done, the politicians or policymakers were slow to accept that science, were slow to even implement what needed to be done to keep communities safe. You remember, for example, some countries like America, Brazil, completely turned down or were hesitant to accept the signs of COVID, and even whatever management was available then when there was no treatment yet and there was no vaccine. However, as time went on and vaccines slowly, or well, let's not say slowly, with vaccines then became available, you also saw that the interconnectedness of politics, science, and economics then made it such that there was even inequity in how decisions were made to even implement those vaccines. So for me, what is lacking and what has not been stressed so much, well, especially because we are talking to journalists, is to be able to stress that interconnectedness of politics, science, and economics. Of course, interwoven into that is the vaccine production, intellectual property of vaccines, and trying to make that initial money from your investment of what you have put into the vaccines. So for me, that's what the major gap is that we should be stressing, so that everyone can then understand that and notice that that has contributed much more to the inequities that we're seeing. Over.
Okay, and thank you very much, Dr. Bassey. I don't know if Dr. Ifeanyi is back with us. Dr. Ifeanyi, are you there? Your mic is off. You are muted. Hello, Dr. Ifeanyi, can you hear us? You are still muted, Dr. Ifeanyi. Okay, I'll come back to Dr. Ifeanyi. So, I would like to before we I ask for Pretty's our lawyers. Your network, Dr. Ifeanyi's network is really we can barely hear him. Before I get back to Dr. Ifeanyi, because he made, I remember a piece that he wrote for NPR, in which he highlighted the unique nature of another aspect of inequality, which is lack of acceptance of vaccines. I'm projecting the tweet he put up on September 18, which was a different shades of. We had a phase in our response to this pandemic in which individuals that were vaccinated in some countries, in some parts of the world, could not have. Were still subjected to some forms of restrictions. Legally, our lawyer, the only lawyer that I think we have on the panel today, did you consider this to be a form of violation on the aspect of human rights, or an acceptable precaution in the context of a global health crisis? And how do you see this playing out in the future when the world is trying to quickly respond to a pandemic? How can we make countries to be able to protect themselves and not still violate the rights of individuals from other parts of the world. In the context of what happened to Dr. Ifeanyi and several others like him in the past. Pretty, yeah, that was for you. I don't know whether you got.
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time, Paul?
Okay, so my question is this: the preference of vaccination from some parts of the world over other parts of the world, legally, was this justifiable, considering the variations in the national vaccination policy, and what can be put in place to ensure that the human rights of individuals and that have been able to do what they are supposed to do are still not violated when they cross borders? I don't know whether the question is clearer now.
No, it's very clear. I think this moment has taught us, this moment meaning the last 2 years, what it's teaching us is that there is a real disconnect between policy and between public health. You know, as they've mentioned, from a public health perspective, what we know is that we are so interconnected, that coming out of this pandemic is going to mean ensuring that the world is equitably vaccinated and has access to other medical products like treatments. From a policy perspective, I've been reflecting on this a lot lately. I think what is being made really evident is that the policy we have to address situations like this pandemic is woefully inadequate. I think the system is working as it was designed to work, with a belief undergirding the market that if you allow the market to work on its own, it can resolve all problems. And we know that not to be true. What we've seen with, for example, Moderna and Pfizer, primarily selling to high-income countries, is evidence of that. They are acting like rational business actors in the market, and we don't have the policy tools really to curtail that. I think there is a tremendous amount of activism happening to bring something called the TRIPS waiver, or a waiver of intellectual property, into place at the global level. But questions around how we would compel companies to go against, traditional market dynamics and actually share knowledge that would go against their business interests, we haven't solved for that yet. And so this, I think, is the big paradox of our time, and one that we would, of course, love to see the world, especially high-income countries, recognizing that this is a problem, that new policies and structures will need to be put into place. But unfortunately, I would say awareness levels and political will seem very low in high-income countries. There's still even the basic understanding that we will not be safe until everyone is safe. It's not widely understood in a pragmatic sense. And so I think these are going to be some of the major challenges of our time now.
Yeah, and I'm really happy you went into the TRIPS waiver, because we had this phase during the response to the COVID-19 pandemic, when the vaccines became available, that other countries, the countries that had hedges over other countries, were commended for actually investing in the vaccines long before they exited clinical trial stage, which is expected from the business point of view to give them some hedge over it. So what do you think an ideal situation would be to be able to encourage pharmaceutical companies to make the risk that such investment would need, and for us to still be able to ensure that everyone is able to have access at the same time? I'll still stay with you, Pretty, before I bring in other panelists on this issue.
No, it's a great question. I think the simplest way to move forward, in the current structures, right, accepting the world that we're in, I believe that the quickest sort of evolution of the system we could make is to just look directly at publicly funded investment. The private market is a much more challenging thing, right? Because you need these incentives for R&D. That's the classical thinking. And so there's a big sort of bigger rock to move there if we wanted to completely rethink that system towards public production. But for publicly funded investment, Moderna, for example, was nearly 100% funded by the US government. And the contract terms were just not favorable for the government under Operation Warp Speed under President Trump. So there should be, at least here in the US, a very serious conversation happening, which it's not, around what should those contract terms have looked like? How could we come up with a template or best practice set where if the government is nearly 100% making an investment in a smaller company, Moderna had no track record on vaccines, remember. It had no history. It was not in a negotiating position at that time. So had they taken on that risk, and if you had told them, you're going to make $25 billion instead of the $100 billion that they're, poised to make, would they have said no? I don't think so. I think that would have been a very good incentive for them. And then the US government could have retained some rights and done, put those the technology into the WHO's technology sharing facility. It could have sub-licensed to manufacturers all over the world. And unfortunately, we didn't see that. So I think that would be one constructive next step forward.
Yeah, thank you very much. I would like to bring in Prof on this issue. Before COVID-19 came, why were we not really particularly interested or aware of the severity of the vaccine inequity issue? And what factors do you think played important roles in ensuring that vaccine inequity is as big as it is presently? Did we miss any signs in the past?
Honestly, people have been talking about the potential for vaccine inequity even before the vaccines actually were publicly available. People could see it coming, and Preeti and people like them have been warning that this is going to happen. That's because we saw what happened with the HIV medicines in the past. We knew kind of history was always going to tell us that whenever new products come, the global north generally likes to get their hands on it first and likes to hoard it. And the drug prices tend to be astronomical when products first come on the market. And that's precisely what has happened, right? So it isn't anything new. I remember UAEM even did a signature campaign well over a year ago, preparing for this, that this is going to happen, right? So I don't think we missed any signs, but I think it has taken multiple variants and waves for the rich countries in the world to sit up and say, oh my God, no matter how many times we get boosted, no matter how much we hoard, this is not going to end for us unless we actually do something. In fact, Omicron truly is some kind of a watershed moment, because now I think everybody is terrified, right? Our illusion of immunity or protection that we felt is kind of falling off in front of our eyes. And even highly vaccinated countries are really on the brink in terms of their health systems. Look at US, look at Canada. So this is a real wake-up call. And I now finally see agitation among an average Canadian citizen who are like, oh my God, this is bad. We got to do more to do something. The leaders are sleeping through this, right? So I don't expect anything enlightened coming out of any of the leaders in the richest nations in the world. It's the citizens who are pushing them hard. And that's why we have so many op-eds and campaigns and webinars and protests and whatnot. And I genuinely believe it's finally the citizens who will push our leaders towards the right path, because the leaders inherently are failing us throughout this pandemic, and they have failed us in the past as well. I think the leadership also should come from the global south. Like today's news that the African company is making its own RNA vaccine. Hell with Moderna, just do it, right? That's exactly what happened with HIV too. When countries show leadership, everybody shuts up, because in a crisis, every country has the right to protect themselves. And then Preeti will tell you there is a TRIPS waiver clause exactly for that eventuality. So I think countries, especially in low and middle income countries, They got to just start doing what they need to do to survive. And they're not look for leadership from the G7 or whatever, because it's not coming.
Yeah, I agree with you. Dr. Bassey, I really enjoyed, and I'm really happy that Prof mentioned the aspect of vaccine manufacturing. In this article that you and your colleagues actually published in the journal, The Lancet Microbe, that you made, you argued in favor of expanding vaccine manufacturing capacity. This was published June last year, around the time that the continent of Africa was just as getting its early set of vaccine doses. Between then and now, we've had the vaccine initiative championed by the WHO to provide some capabilities, and in South Africa we've also had a number of agreements signed by a number of African countries with some vaccine manufacturers. But recently at a session, the Africa CDC suggested that most of the doses that African countries are still getting from outside the continent. That the ones that the continent contributed in producing some are still not significant. So, what do you consider? Do you still believe that expanding local manufacturing capability is still the best way forward, instead of prioritizing distribution and equitable sharing of doses?
I think it shouldn't be an either or. I think we should be doing both. That means whatever has been produced now, which have been mainly in high-income countries, is being hoarded in high-income countries, okay? And it will take so long to get to low-income countries. Professor Pai just talked about the fact that community groups, civil society organizations, and ordinary people on the streets are holding governments accountable, high-income governments, country accountable, to push and also donate viable vaccines that have long shelf life now, to low and middle income countries. You know that it takes quite a long time to invest, and for those investments into infrastructure, and then, well, although scientists in low and middle income countries have the science, well, they know the science, but the investment in the infrastructure, factories, and even contracts that allow them to then implement every single aspect of the production and the supply chain will happen. Currently, low and middle income countries probably have the wrong end of the stick, where they are only allowed, through contracts that they have, to only package and distribute, rather than manufacture and then package and distribute within their own countries. Current contracts only allow them to package and distribute what is made in high-income countries. So I still believe, that we should do the two. Whilst it would take 5, 10 to 15 years for low and middle income countries to be able to produce as fast as high income countries and distribute that within low and middle income countries, I think we can take the opportunity now, because the vaccines are available globally. We have enough doses globally to be able to vaccinate citizens of the world. It's just that high-income countries choose to hoard them. And if we go back to the first statements where we talk about the fact that politics, science, and economics are interwoven, where the politics aspect of it is really showing up negatively is the fact that political office holders, well, politics is a transient condition. And every 4 years, politicians think about, how to retain their power, stay in office, and perpetuate all that their manifesto would allow them to do. In fact, there is also the 2 yearly midterm elections. And the question you asked, Preeti, well, in reference to where Ifeanyi's op-ed was linked very much to the transient nature of political office. Political office holders made the pronouncements they made just playing to the gallery of their own populations. And so, well, then coming back to the question you asked, I think we should do both. Where we should distribute available vaccines that we have now, whilst we promote the ability and capability of low and middle income countries to manufacture theirs and then distribute within their countries. Over.
Okay, thank you. So I would like us to discuss reporting vaccine inequity. So, Prof, what have you inferred? What can you infer from how this issue has been reported in the media? What do you think journalists are getting right, and what do you think they are getting wrong?
So I think there's some strange stuff happening in the last few months. And that is whenever we point out the inequities in vaccines, especially about the low rate of coverage in the African continent, the immediate response is, oh, but Africans are hesitant, right? Africans don't want to be vaccinated. Africans don't know how to vaccinate. Africans cannot absorb donations when given to them. Africans don't have cold chain, right? There's an endless series of such bullshit that is being propagated. And it's almost as if some of the richest countries in the world, or pharma companies and their representatives, are trying to undermine the need for vaccine equity. And now things have gotten even worse. The word on the street is, oh, Omicron is taking care of everybody's vaccination, right? You don't need the vaccine, because Omicron is anywhere running through the world and you're done, right? The pandemic is over. Omicron is the natural immunizing event. And in any case, Africans don't want the vaccination, right? And look, see what some country did. They had to discard vaccines. They don't want vaccines. And what they don't tell you is these vaccines are often donated with very little time left on them, right? With a few weeks before expiration. And what they don't tell you is, and look at some egregious headlines by Reuters and others, right? African countries dump vaccines. It's actually the rich countries that dumped about to expire vaccines on Africa, not Africa dumping vaccines. So this is a very, very worrisome trend that I'm noticing. And you have to work very hard to counter this narrative. And the most worrisome narrative is that the pandemic is over. And the pandemic is over because some privileged folks in the global north decided that it's over. Where does that come from, right? Everything is done. We're taking care of everything. And there's not even an acknowledgement of how many people are completely unprotected. What if there is a worse variant? We got lucky with Omicron. But what if the next variant is as transmissible as Omicron and as lethal as Delta? We'll have people gasping and dying the way that they did in India. And we can't afford that, right? And as Preeti said, there should also be access to rapid tests. Hardly anyone speaks about access to self-tests for COVID in low and middle income countries. I could get them here, Preeti could get them in the US, but what happens to other countries, right? So there was a campaign now underway to convince WHO to push harder to release a guideline on home tests for all countries, not just the rich countries. What about the antiviral medicines? Don't low and middle income countries need a good therapeutic? Beyond steroids, what do we have? Not a lot to offer patients who are sick, right? So there's so many gaps. I think the coverage by some of the Western media has been atrocious, downright racist, and ridiculously misleading. It's like people who don't know shit about what they're writing are writing headlines. And we got to call them out. We got to tell them that this is a reckless and irresponsible way of reporting. If you don't know how to report, just don't report about it, right? Don't add to the confusion by these misleading kinds of headlines. And we have to constantly call out this bullshit. It's like, it's never ending, and it's getting worse and worse now with all sorts of people declaring that the pandemic is over, right? If there's a pandemic is over, then what are we having this conversation for? What's the point in fighting for vaccine equity, right? Might as well close everything and go home, right? And this is very insidious, and it gives rich countries a way out to not do what they should be doing.
Yeah, thank you very much for those straight and direct words. Preeti, do you share a similar sentiment with Prof? And what other issues do you think the media is getting wrong in covering vaccine inequity?
Yeah, I agree with Madhu that it's primarily, from what I can see, a high-income country journalism problem. And it's already been successful. The mindsets, if you talk to just people, in community here at any level, honestly, is that this is here to stay. So you see that people are just wanting to go back to their lives, and they have. Now, like Madhu said, we have family in other countries too. And from my family in different countries, particularly in India, it's not that it's different there. My family there is also trying to just go back to normal. People are not wearing masks. There is sort of this sense of, well, this is just a situation at this point. But I think here, at least in the States, journalism has a very important role to play that is not being played. There's a lot of comparisons, to the flu. The endemic conversation is very pervasive now. And there's not a recognition. There's definitely not a deference at all, or any sort of respect in listening to the public health expertise. And part of this that I find very interesting that might be worth mentioning is that I think from the beginning, there's been a dehistoricizing of the pandemic, right? This pandemic is just happening right now, but nothing came before it. There's no experiences to learn from. And as the public health community, I think we know that there are many lessons to learn. We know that when epidemics and pandemics hit, that we live in a hierarchy of health, that some people get access to diagnostics and testing, and treatment and vaccines first, and some don't get it at all, even a decade later. And so we're seeing that play out in slow motion right now. I think there's a huge role for the media to play in starting to course correct on some of these things, particularly about the real risks of what lie ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. And I wouldn't want to rob Dr. Bassey of his thoughts too on what is your assessment of the coverage of vaccine inequity? You are talking directly to journalists, so. Your mic is off.
I think that. Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I think that journalists do what they can to cover news, and they want to sell. They want to sell their papers, they want to sell, their news. And so they fall into that double-edged sword part of, on the one hand, wanting to report science, on the other hand, wanting to make it too sweet to be believed. And well, the third thing they should actually be trying to do has already been talked about by my colleagues, of holding politicians to account. So whilst journalists are trying to do what, well, they always do in reporting about health, well-being, and also holding government to account, I think they fall into the tried and tested pitfall of over storicizing whatever they are reporting, and perhaps trying to contain first, just tell the story as it is first, medically, for the benefit of everyone. Number two, hold government to account to try to save lives. Well, and then the rest would follow. But I'm sure the journalists would not, or printing houses would not, well, agree with me, because they will tell you that the first thing is marketing. The first thing is their profit. Yeah, so that's what I'll just add there. Yeah.
Yes, so thank you very much. For Pretty, I would like to understand what you think could be done to maintain and ensure equitable access. At least we are going through this pandemic, but by going through other aspects of healthcare, like the global health perspective in general, what measures do you think we've learned from the current pandemic needs to be addressed, and what do you think can be put in place so that future health incidences would not also suffer a similar fate like the vaccine inequity? What can be put in place legally and that will be binding, that everybody would cooperate with?
Yeah, I think that if we were able to make these changes, like I was mentioning, to publicly funded inventions, I think as of it, almost a year ago, there was almost $100 billion that had gone into of public funding for vaccine development. So I think at national level, if we were able to bring in this shift, I think it would be significant, so that even now, any further, research and development where governments using taxpayer funding are investing in the development of medical products, if we can shift, the contract terms to say, that the government has the ability to take any technology that's developed and share it as necessary to bring equity, to make sure that the rest of the world can get those the medical products, that would be great. That's one. I continue to think that the TRIPS waiver will set an important precedent. Right now, we're seeing that the process has been a bit stalled because South Africa, India, and the other countries are trying to make sure that the waiver is not just for vaccines, it is for treatments and other medical products. And I believe it's the US and the EU who are pushing back on that. We've also seen a lot of delay in the discussions because of Omicron, or because Omicron is being used as a shield. But right now, the WTO DG and the countries are all saying that, okay, let's try to get a resolution to this by the end of February. It remains to be seen whether that'll be done. But if that happens, I think it sets important precedent, because the next time around, maybe we can have a waiver sooner. And then third, I think the big gap that we have is that there are no mechanisms to mandate the sharing of knowledge. Our market incentives are all lined up to encourage locking up knowledge. The entire system of intellectual property is predicated on the fact that if you're the one to develop something, you get to lock up the knowledge, which is a different thing than you should be rewarded for your work or for your invention. And so I think this moment is raising philosophical questions about the market we've constructed, where medicine is not a global public good. The incentives we have in place, which incentivize private returns, profit, but don't include an element of knowledge sharing, particularly in the face of global crises like this one. So I think these are integral policy questions that we're going to have to start to look at and figure out, how do we institutionalize these changes going forward? And perhaps more to the point of what Madhu has been saying, and how do we build the public education and the public pressure for that change?
And if I can just add something here to what Preeti said, it is getting to be very tiring that the same small set of people and voices around the world are constantly talking about the need for vaccine equity. And I think we need many, many more people to join this, the chorus. And I think media can play a big role here, right? If there is a relentless pressure on, say, the G7 leaders, right now, if you are a journalist and you're working in Canada or EU, you should be writing a lot about why EU and Canada are blocking the TRIPS IT waiver. You should be writing more about why high-income countries have not donated anywhere close to what they pledged to COVAX, and why they are donating so late when the vaccines are close to expiration. If you're focused on the global South, you should be aiming your articles at African leaders, saying, what are we doing as Africans to increase our domestic manufacturing capacity? Why are we not pushing more for the TRIPS waiver? So we need relentless light to be shined on this inequities from all sides. And only then I think public pressure will also, because the public doesn't quite know sometimes what the problem is. And I think good reporting can go a long way. And I think that needs to happen in the global North as well as in the global South.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will still stay with you, Prof, because I have a question on uh, trying to connect COVID-19 inequity with tuberculosis, the global TB response. But before that question, I desire to take a question live today. So if you have a question that you would like to ask live, please raise your hand so that I can activate your mic. I only have space for one person to ask. So please indicate by raising your hand, and I'll pick the first person to raise hand. Prof, I know you've prior to COVID, you've actually been also talking about inequity in the global response to tuberculosis. Do you see the current state of the world's global TB response as what do you think it portrays from the inequity perspective to how COVID-19 can eventually become? Do you see any potential connection between the current state of TB response from the perspective of inequity to the future of COVID-19 pandemic?
So TB is very much like COVID. It thrives on inequities, right? Whether it's the poorest people developing the disease or the most disadvantaged communities that are most affected. TB primarily is a disease of Black and brown people, right, globally. And at one point, all of us know that people were dying of TB in North America and Europe, right? About 100 years ago, these were dominant diseases in the global North. And then with the improved economic situation and housing and reduction in poverty, TB steadily declined in the global North and primarily became endemic, right? That's why the word endemicity raises alarm bells for people like me, because TB is endemic, but we still lose 1.5 million people every year. And the response to TB is nothing like COVID. I'll just give you one example. Right now, if you are born anywhere in the world, like my baby was born, she could get only one vaccine, and that's called BCG, right? That BCG is exactly 100 years old as of this year. 1921, Pasteur Institute in Lille, France, trialed the BCG vaccine. It's the same damn vaccine that your child, my child, will get today. No investments, nothing compared to the billions, multiples of billions of dollars of COVID vaccine investments. Why? Because when COVID affected the rich North, when COVID affected white people, money flowed like water. And that's why we are lucky to have all of these mRNA vaccines in a span of 1 year. TB primarily affects Black and brown people in the global South, nobody could care less. That's why investments in TB vaccine is pretty much at a standstill, and we are still using a 100-year-old vaccine. That just tells you that if the global North declares pandemic over for them and COVID becomes concentrated in the global South, it'll become tuberculosis. It'll become a malaria. It'll ravage the lives of Black and brown people in the global South, and global North will simply stop caring about it, invest in it, and they would not even consider this as a problem for them. Just like nobody here even thinks about TB, right? Who cares about TB, right? Because the TB has disappeared here, right? That's the worrisome thing about endemicity. Endemic for whom? Endemic maybe not for the North, but it becomes endemic in the South, like malaria and TB, and it'll continue to kill millions of Africans and Indians and Asians. And we got to fight back against this and demand that there is a proportionate response to this whole issue.
Yeah, we have Clyden on the line. Clyden, are you ready to ask a question?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you. So far, the conversation has mostly focused on what countries such as in Africa, Asia can do. In the Caribbean, which is where I'm from, we have a particular concern. Our size has played, size has worked against us. We've had issues in terms of vaccine deliveries and so on. What solutions should small island developing states, which is my question, what solutions should small island developing states strive for in this debate?
Did anybody get the question? Yeah, sorry, can you move closer to your mic? Okay, please. Yes, can you go through the question?
I was asking, what solution should small island developing states seek in discussion about vaccine inequality, especially given our size?
I think his question is about the peculiarity of the small islands and what. Yes. So, Dr. Bassey, do you want to give that a shot?
Well, I didn't hear all that he talked about, but I think he mentioned something about small island states of the Caribbean.
Yes.
Yeah, well, can I quickly ask, what is the level of vaccination, COVID vaccination in your country, for example?
Clyden, are you there? Okay.
Yes, I'm still here. In the Caribbean, many countries have not gotten to 4% as yet. So in Dominican Republic,
2%?
yes, it's high, but in most smaller states, it's extremely low, below 50%.
Yeah.
Dr. Bassey?
So your question, so your question was then,
how do we secure access for countries with smaller in terms of population?
Yeah, well, I think it's the same. Well, thank you for the question. Well, but I think it's the same answer that Pi and the rest have, well, we've talked about. We do have enough vaccines to go around the world for, well, to vaccinate the population of the world against COVID. In fact, the proximity of most Caribbean states and small island states to the US and to Chile and to Brazil should actually make it very easy, because of your very small populations, to vaccinate everyone, at least to get the first dose. Well, the population of most small island states in the Caribbean are so very, very small compared to Africa, compared to India, compared to China. You know, that if the US wanted to vaccinate or wanted to donate, let's say, that could be done very easily. But we are talking about the same thing of the link between politics, science, and economics, the leaders of high-income countries do not want to donate yet without, according to them, ensuring that they have vaccinated everyone in their own countries. And it would be really good for vaccines to be made available to contiguous states or states that are closer to high-income countries, especially because for your own Caribbean countries, they really depend on tourism from high-income countries, and they keep tourism afloat for high-income countries. And for me, it should actually be very easy to do, to say, okay, let us keep our cash cow alive by vaccinating everyone in the small island states, so that the tourism that we rely on would continue.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that submission. I'm really, really happy Dr. Ifeanyi is back with us. Dr. Ifeanyi, are you there?
Hi. Yeah.
Yeah, so I give you the floor. So we've been having this conversation around vaccine inequity and its implication for global health. From your personal experience, how serious is the situation, and how do you think we ought to go from here?
Okay, thank you again, and apologies. I mean, the poor network in my country happened to me today, and here we are. So
sorry, I got this joke. Internet inequity is also a problem that we need.
It's also a problem. So I had to travel distances to connect to another network now. So I think, as shocking as COVID-19 vaccine inequity is also not new. Let's be honest about it, because the global health as a whole, is colonial. It's always, richer countries coming to help, poorer countries, and having this notion that poorer countries do not know what to do. It's just that this one played out in a pandemic. Every country is affected, and we just saw it play out, in real time. And again, talking about the COVID-19 vaccine inequity, when you go back to 2020, inequity started with things like personal protective equipment, and has gone to vaccine. Of course, but it's also going to happen with the therapeutics, and even diagnostics. And I don't know how many of you saw the news item, coming out of the UK 3 days ago, that the UK government is about to write off billions of dollars in procurement of personal protective equipment that they hoarded to the detriment of poorer nations. And so it just shows you that this is just the norm, if we're being honest about it. And it's so shameful, because we look at the global south as, well, you guys know everything. You should know that in a pandemic, you cannot be talking about vaccine nationalism, which I think was a very fancy way of describing a very bad thing. Because when you hear vaccine nationalism, I think it's a good thing. But when you look deeper, you find out that it's something that is quite selfish. And I'm at a loss at how the WHO would declare this pandemic over with such, low vaccine coverage in the global south. How are they going to declare it over? Yesterday, again, I saw a news item coming out of Denmark that Denmark, is removing every restriction, and they are going back to normal. The UK, the health secretary yesterday was talking about, the UK living with COVID, the way they are living with the flu. So this just goes to show you that richer countries, again, have moved on. And, I came in when Madu was talking about TB and how it's been neglected. And Madu, that was a graphic you shared from that pandemic site where they tried to visualize the COVID-19 vaccine coverage. And when I looked at it, what just struck me was that, again, COVID-19 is becoming an African disease. Because one of those graphics where they use vaccination rates, you just saw that it was only Africa that was colored red. So COVID-19 is systematically going to become an African disease. And yet again, we're going to face all sorts of inequities as a result of it. we face inequities of richer countries telling us that they will not recognize the same vaccines that they donated to COVAX, that they simply because those vaccines were not manufactured within the EU region or in the UK, or manufactured in India by the same manufacturer. It's crazy the kind of things that you hear in this pandemic. But going forward, you know, I think that there's so much hope in the sense that this has at least pushed African countries to begin to think about how do we manufacture vaccines locally? Because we cannot keep depending on richer countries, if we're being honest. And another thing is that if you look at, if we're going to continue trading blames, we need to hold African leaders, past and present, responsible. Because look at capital, look at illicit capital outflows out of the continent, $50 billion estimated every year. So just imagine, sometimes when I think about it, imagine if we had that money available to deal with this thing, we probably would have been in front of the line as far as procuring these vaccines are concerned. And so for me, going forward, it's a good thing that as a continent, we're beginning to wake up, because this will not be the last pandemic. And I know that Africa is a continent that believes so much in God. Everybody thinks, it won't happen to them, but another pandemic will happen most likely in our lifetime. So this will be the last one. But beyond that, if you look at the WHO reports coming, epidemiological reports coming out of the WHO Afro region, we're dealing with at least 110 different infectious disease outbreaks now. What about the vaccines for those, for those infections? So it's a good thing that we're beginning to manufacture locally. And I hope that Africans would wake up to hold our leaders accountable to do the right things for us. Not every time we're depending on the global south. These guys are more interested in their people. We cannot keep, waiting for them to bail us, at every point in time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ifeanyi. And it's really impressive that we've been able to look at this from different angles. And we're already beyond the 1 hour mark. So what I would like to do now is, if you can take 30 seconds, I want you to think deeply, and what do you consider to be the take-home point that is relevant in this case for individual journalists? What do you think journalists should know? What is your take-home point for journalists? So let me start with, whose name is coming from my head? I'll start with Pretty.
Yeah, it's a difficult question for me because, I live in the US. I would say here, for us here, we have a reckoning to have about, as I said, the fact that public health and policy are so disconnected, and that there's no political will to do anything. There's a complete lack of either understanding or political will, that we're so deeply interconnected. And beyond that, we just have a basic ethical obligation as humans on this planet to understand the situation and make sure that our response to this pandemic is global and not nationalistic in nature. I think here I would say that it should be the main focus for journalists and the public health community to be working much more closely together to try to shift the public consciousness on this issue.
Well, you are muted, Paul.
Yeah, so I'll go with Dr. Bassey. What is your take-home point for journalists?
Yeah, well, putting what Pretty has said in another way, I think we should call for greater dialogue between science and politics. That greater dialogue, you remember we said in the beginning that politics, science, and economics is so interwoven. And with greater dialogue between science and politics, it will be good for political leaders to not just play to the gallery, but really try to use science. And looking at the power of social media these days, journalists should push through social media for local people to hold politicians to account. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Ifeanyi, what do you consider to be the take-home point for journalists?
Okay, so I think for me, it's, that journalists have a huge responsibility to write about these things, report them accurately, and report them equitably. And I say this because of how 3 media houses, one in Thailand, one in Spain, and the other one, I've forgotten the third country, that reported once Omicron came out and did all sorts of, cartoons about Omicron, depicting Omicron as Africans and, being an African disease. I mean, I wrote a piece because of that for NPR. But I think when I saw that the first time, I was like, how can an editor approve that kind of piece? A piece that depicted Africans as, as Omicron viruses inside a boat, with the flag of South Africa approaching the EU shoreline with the flag of the EU at the shoreline. How can an editor approve that kind of piece? It made me angry. It made me scared, because these are the kind of things that lead to xenophobia. Africans may be killed simply because an editor approved a piece that he or she thought would get clicks. But I'm happy that eventually they apologized, but then this piece had gone out. So it's just to say that for me, that major takeaway is that journalists, editors, I don't know what titles they have, must know that they have a huge responsibility to report accurately and equitably, because what they write have very far-reaching consequences. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Prof, what's take-home messages for journalists today?
The biggest take-home message is this pandemic is far from over. Please do not listen to bullshit from people who don't know what they're talking about, declaring the pandemic over. Omicron is the last variant. It's just undiluted BS. The pandemic will continue to ravage people because we have left 3.2 billion people unprotected. There will be new variants. It is only a matter of how bad the next variant will be, not a question of if there will be. So continuing to shine a light on vaccine inequity is critical for all of us, no matter where we live, because our destinies are all tied together. There is no end for just the global north or just for US, for UK. We have to fight together. And I think journalists can play a huge role in continuing to speak up about this inequity.
Yes, thank you very much. What I would like participants to know is that each of these panelists, if we have them one by one, we cannot even exhaust the topics within 1 hour, and it shows you the importance of this conversation and why we have to be intentional about what we write and ensure we have all the necessary information so that we can write robust and useful pieces that are true reflection of the situation of things in many places, to also ensure that we are not contributing, we are not part of the problem, but we are doing our role, which is rightly informing the general public on the situation of things. So I really want to, on behalf of the International Center for Journalists, and specifically the team responsible for the ICFJ Pamela Howard Forum on Global Crisis Reporting, I want to thank our experts today for accepting our invitation to have this conversation with our journalists. And I hope individual journalists, you've been able to find 1 or 2 things that will be relevant in your reporting of this vaccine inequity. COVID-19 is not over, it's still right here. So we have to have better understanding of how this pandemic is playing out, so that the general public will be better informed regarding the state of the pandemic. To access more information for journalists, especially regarding your COVID-19 reporting, I encourage you to visit IGNet platform on www.ignet.org, and to also access more information about this project from the International Center for Journalists, please check out ICFJ website on www.icfj.org. And particularly what is important, I also want to encourage you to be part of our Facebook Facebook community by joining our Facebook group, which is the international. If you go to Facebook and you search for the forum, you are going to find it. But instead of going through the stress of that, I just put the link to the forum in the chat box so that you can click it and you can easily access information. And we also have a major announcement from ICFJ. If you run a media outlet and you feel overloaded with business decisions, the International Center for Journalists has something for you. So this is encouraging. This is aimed at those that run media outlets and sometimes taking business decisions as the media outlet becomes a burden. So I encourage you to access more information about this special offer that ICFJ has for you via the ICFJ Elevate initiative, which I've just put the link in the chat box. So on behalf of everybody on this panel, I say thank you very much for taking out time of your busy schedule to join us. And Prof, he would definitely be back with us for training. I was a beneficiary of one of the trainings he facilitated even before the pandemic on global health reporting, and it has actually been critical and useful for me personally as a journalist. So I know he's always happy to interact with journalists and help us to further expand our reporting skills. So I will reach out to him on the timing so that we can have him to train our journalists very well enough on any aspect of global health reporting. So that is something that I'm looking forward to having. So once again, I say thank you very much and have a lovely day. Thanks everyone, and bye.